tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
Catherine Swift is the president of the Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers and Businesses of Canada and joins me now. It's always good to talk to her. Catherine, thanks for coming on today.
My pleasure, Andrew.
So obviously, I mean, industry in Canada was harmed by the plastics ban in the first place. You have some companies where literally products they made were effectively outlawed overnight or made so prohibitive for people to get in Canada. And now even with the court ruling, I think on one hand, it's easy to say it's a bit of a win, but it hasn't changed the precariousness, which is that you have a government declaring war on plastic. And I think for starters, it's based on a very false premise. The plastics that are ending up in turtles' noses in Asia and Africa are not coming from Canada and the United States, which have very good waste management systems. But it's companies in Canada that pay the price for these things. So what has the impact been of this ban in the first place on Canadian industry?
Well, it's definitely companies pay, but companies also pass the increased costs on to consumers. Let's face it. People at a time when an awful lot of small hospitality businesses, for example, restaurants, hotels, and so on, are still struggling to get out of their pandemic, depression. This increased cost because they had to replace all this stuff. The alternatives are invariably more expensive, and they're often worse.
Mm-hmm.
For the environment. That was one of the classic elements of it that was utterly ridiculous. But it's just another hit on business. The other thing, and anybody that knows anything about plastics knew this from the get-go. They outlawed things like straws, as you say, and apparently that one picture of the one turtle, and I love turtles, so I would sympathize with the turtle, but that one picture of the poor turtle precipitated a ban on the entire, and the paper straws that replaced it were found to have toxic materials in them. I mean, I shouldn't be laughing. It's utterly ludicrous, but it is almost comedic if it weren't so serious. We have thousands of jobs in the plastics industry in Canada. The things they banned were mere virtue signaling. They're not the worst sources of plastic waste, for example. Water bottles are. And I guess if we weren't all using paper box water bottle thingies or whatever, then we should be worrying about that. But I think they thought they'd get too much blowback from consumers. But frankly, I think water bottles are ridiculous to use at all because they're unnecessary. We have good water in this country. But anyway, the things that they banned were virtue signaling. They weren't realistic at all. Calling them toxic, and this, of course, is where the judge's decision came in. And they had the bad luck of getting a judge that actually had some science background. She had a master's degree in biology, so she actually knew some of this stuff a lot better than seemingly Minister Guilbeault did. So it was merely a virtue signaling exercise that hurt business at a bad time. Not that it's ever a good time, but hurt consumers naturally, drove up prices, therefore fed inflation yet again, and did nothing for the environment, but added all kinds of costs to our economy and on very false premises as well. And yeah, Canada isn't an offender on this front. Plastics are eminently recyclable. Many types of plastics are infinitely recyclable. Mm-hmm. You can recycle them. And granted, we'd have to have better facilities. We already do some of that, but we need to have better facilities in the future to do that. But to call this whole area, which is so incredibly helpful to our society, we would never have gotten through the pandemic without plastics. They're sanitary, they're sterile. There's something that in the medical profession, they can shape them into all kinds of interesting shapes that suit the purpose. They actually use less heat and energy to create than a lot of metals do. So they're actually better for the environment in that respect. Mm-hmm. And there's in the automobile industry, for example, having plastic parts, body, auto body and so on, means they're lighter and therefore more fuel efficient.
So, well, and a couple of years ago, we were just trumpeting the innovation of 3D printers. And now, it's, plastics are terrible. No one should do anything with plastic. And you mentioned earlier, and I had alluded to this, and I don't have the numbers handy, but there was a massive study a few years back on plastic in the ocean. And it was literally the entirety of it was from Africa and Asia. I think it was like eight rivers in Asia that contributed to almost all of it. And then 2 rivers in Africa. And a lot of it is discarded fishing gear. It's not even trash that's thrown in the water. But similar to with emissions, And emissions and plastics are the same thing. We get virtue signaling Western politicians that force Canadians, in our context, to pay for problems that, if they are problems, are being caused by the Chinas and the Indias of the world. And it's the same as emissions. Canada is what, 2% of global emissions. If you think emissions are the bad
1.5.
guy, it's China.
1.5.
Yeah, there we go. So, but we're the ones that have to deal with the carbon tax while China is opening new coal plants.
And the carbon tax is damaging our economy so badly. I can't tell you how many of our business members are leaving the country, or they're maybe leaving a little bit of a facility here, but they're going south of the border, for example,
I
or
know it's
elsewhere,
anecdotal, but
possibly
that's
overseas.
that you swear by that companies in Canada are reducing their footprint or leaving altogether because of it.
Totally, totally. And it's been going on for a number of years. So, the notion this is badly harming the Canadian economy. Imports are, and the farce of it is imports are coming in from the abusers, the Chinas, the Thailands, the Malaysia, Indonesia. These are all the countries that are the main causes, as you mentioned, of the plastic waste in the ocean. And they're doing absolutely nothing. But our businesses are having to leave because they're no longer competitive. And it's not just the carbon tax. That's one big factor, because the other countries don't have one. But it's also, we have pretty good environmental rules in Canada, and we have had for a very long time. The Liberals can't take credit for that. But these other countries don't. They abuse the environment like crazy. So our businesses, who are following all the rules, paying gobs of taxes, following stringent environmental procedures and so on, they have to leave because they won't be able to do business anymore. What a stupid policy.
Well, and one of the challenges, too, is that on one hand, and look, I'm a big free trade fan, and I believe that free trade has come with some costs. Globalization has come with some costs. But generally speaking, we have a government that is very pro-globalization, a government that says we need to be connected with the world, but doesn't want to compete against other countries, because that's the reality. Businesses are very mobile now, more so in 2023 than ever before. They can do exactly what you just described. They can pick up stakes and go elsewhere, which means we need to compete on regulations and on taxes with all of these other countries. And it's so ridiculous that the government has failed to realize that, or realized it, but is putting that virtue signaling above the national economic interests of Canada and its corporations.
Care. I've concluded, Andrew, they just don't care because they're so focused on their ideological, narrow ideological cause, which is the climate.
Well, yeah, Stephen Guilbeault
they don't
an
really
avowed
seem to
ideal.
care.
Yeah.
It very ideological. Although it's quite hilarious when they saw that it was costing them gobs of votes in a liberal rich vote area of the country, Atlantic Canada, they suddenly, all their principles went out the window and they gave them a break on heating oil. So let's face it, the hypocrisy is overwhelming, but it's doing real damage. And no, I don't think they even understand or care how many businesses and jobs and whatnot are being driven out of the country. We've seen by a number of recent studies, we've seen that our GDP per capita, which is a source of, it's a very good indicator of standard of living, it's been dropping precipitously. We've always been lower than the US, but now we're over 30% lower than the US. And it continues to decline. That kind of indicator is not good for Canadians. And if we want to enjoy the kind of lifestyle we've gotten accustomed to, something's got to change fast. And if business can't compete in Canada, and we got government growing like crazy, and that's not something that adds to our productivity at all, quite the contrary, it's a drag on productivity, then we got a lot of problems to deal with.
I mentioned earlier that even with the federal court decision last week striking down the plastics ban, we have a federal government that's going to appeal it. We have a federal government that is probably going to try to put some modified version in place, and then we go back to square one and we have to restart the court process. So I'm not convinced. It's a win, and I don't want to take that away from it, but I'm not convinced it puts businesses that are concerned about this or people that are concerned about this in the clear. So there still is this precariousness. And I wanted to ask about that because, it's one thing for a company or a corporation to say, we're leaving Canada because X, Y, Z, whatever those things are. It's another thing for a company to say, we just have no idea what the future is going to hold, and it's safer to go elsewhere. And I think that must be happening as well.
Oh, very much so. You can see how bad investment, non-residential investment, because we know our housing market's out of control price-wise, but non-residential investment, which is a source, again, of wealth that promotes our standard of living, that's been declining for years under the Trudeau government. And a lot of it is uncertainty. There's a lot of uncertainties in the world of business, no matter what. We don't need the government to add more and more and more. And yet that's what they've done. And the Supreme Court, as you may recall, just about a month ago, struck down the Bill C-69, the so-called No More Pipelines bill. And that had introduced all kinds of uncertainty for large projects in Canada.
Yeah, and that was, again, one where you've had a couple of major projects that have just said, it's not worth it. And then it was particularly bad when you had Trudeau on this side of the border and Biden on the other side of the border. And, the long anticipated Keystone project just became dead on arrival. So, obviously, you've had the opportunity to speak to a number of political leaders. I know Premier Danielle Smith in Alberta and Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative leader. I mean, are you optimistic that if, in Alberta's case, where she's in government, or at the national level where Poilievre wants to form government, that they can turn this around? Or are the problems too great right now for a government to really solve in a 4-year term?
Well, they're going to be hamstrung by our debt for sure. Not so much Alberta. Alberta, the energy industry, the fossil fuel industry has been doing quite well, and that's really helped their bottom line, as well as Canada's. I found it so ironic, laughably ironic, that the Liberals were celebrating that they had greater revenues than they had forecast. It's all because of the oil and gas industry, which they hate. So, talk about hypocrisy. But of course, things can be turned around. And we showed it back in the 90s, and that was a Liberal government. The largest cuts in government, and the left loves to say, "Oh, the Conservatives will cut." It was Liberals that did it, and they did it because they had to do it. Whoever was in government at the time would have had to do it because we were up against it financially, big time. But that's going to happen again, I'm afraid, because our debt is so high. So yes, things can be reversed, but not quickly. It's going to take time, and it's going to hurt.
All right, Catherine Swift, always good to talk to you, president of the Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers and Businesses of Canada. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.